Hi everyone, let's have a look at this syllabus dot point, evaluate the impact of scientific knowledge on the manipulation of plant and animal reproduction in agriculture. So let's start with the verb evaluate. When we're evaluating something, we know that we've got to make a judgment based on reasons, and those reasons could be both for and or against. Today we are evaluating the impact of scientific knowledge on the manipulation of plant and animal reproduction. And our limiting factor is that we're doing this in the context of agriculture. So we want to know how scientific knowledge has impacted plant and animal reproduction. Let's have a look at the content required to answer this particular question. To do this, we're going to use a table. And the table is divided up into two. So we're going to have a look at what scientific knowledge has allowed the development of plant and animal reproductive techniques, or manipulation in agriculture. So we're going to look at some agricultural examples as we go along. Our first example of a reproductive technique or manipulation in agriculture is selective breeding. Now, this has been used by humans for centuries, whereby plants and animals considered to have favourable characteristics have been sexually reproducing to produce offspring for that area of agriculture. So I've put here example plants. Some of the characteristics that humans would have looked for may have included disease resistance or producing fruit for a long period of time, and that would have had an impact to increase food production. If we have a look at the scientific knowledge that underpins the process of selective breeding or artificial selection, we have this knowledge that parents pass on traits to offspring. And even as early as 1859, Charles Darwin discussed the idea of selective breeding as resulting in changes in species over time. So historically, selective breeding would have involved the domestication of animals that we now know as farm animals, cows, sheep, goats, etc. Our next example of a reproductive technique is artificial pollination. This is the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma in order to self-pollinate or cross-pollinate. A current example from agriculture is within the kiwi fruit industry. Because of the high number of bee visits that are required to pollinate just the one flower, what farmers can do to speed up the process of pollination is to use artificial pollination on top of what the bees are already doing. Now, there'll be more on this information in a link that I'll post up on the classroom. The scientific knowledge that has impacted on this reproductive technique of artificial pollination is that plant sexual reproduction involves gametes, and those gametes are the pollen and the ovule within the flower. Artificial insemination is our next reproductive technique in agriculture, whereby semen is collected from male animals in order to insert into the female. The scientific knowledge that has impacted on the use of artificial insemination is, to start with, fertilisation, where male and female gametes join to form a zygote, which forms the offspring. And most importantly, that semen needs to be frozen for storage and transport to maintain the cellular integrity of the sperm. This is the most important component of artificial insemination, as today in agriculture, it means that, for example, cow farmers do not have to have a bull on site in order to produce offspring from their cows. In vitro fertilisation is another example of a manipulation of animal reproduction in agriculture. Eggs are taken from a female and fertilised by sperm outside of the body. The zygote is then grown using nutrients and is inserted into the uterus of a specific female at the appropriate stage of its development. The scientific knowledge that has been used to develop in vitro fertilisation is that of fertilisation and implantation of the blastocyst. So By scientists knowing at what stage the blastocyst is implanted into the uterus naturally, they can mimic that artificially. In vitro fertilisation has been quite useful in agriculture, as a female selected with elite characteristics can have a number of her eggs extracted, fertilised, and then implanted into a many number of individuals of that same species of animal. This means that the number of offspring that one individual can produce is greatly increased by using the process of IVF. Cloning is the next reproductive technique that we will be looking at. It involves producing an identical copy of the parent organism. One of the body cells, which we call a somatic cell of the parent, is taken, its nucleus extracted, and placed into an egg cell, likely from a donor, whose nucleus has been extracted. Once this has been achieved, this zygote can then develop as a normal organism. The scientific knowledge that underpins cloning includes knowing that the nucleus contains all of the genetic information required for an organism, as well as knowing that the zygote, once formed, undergoes cell division to form a normal offspring. Genetic modification can also be used in agriculture. It involves the transfer of a segment of DNA, which codes for a gene, from one organism to another in order to improve its characteristics. In plants, the organism can then be propagated or tissue cultured in order to produce a clone with the same genetic modification. This saves scientists from having to take each organism within the species and insert the gene into it separately. The scientific knowledge that allowed genetic modification to occur is that genes for traits are located on the DNA molecules. As well as that, the scientific knowledge involved in cloning genetically modified organisms is that they naturally reproduce through asexual reproduction, such as vegetative propagation, or can be done artificially through the manipulation by scientists in the process of tissue culture.